drive to all my subscribers. Right hand drive Ron here. If you notice today, I'm underneath the Acty truck. You may ask why. Well, as Spider-Man's uncle would say, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, with 30-year-old Japanese truck comes great opportunities. Those opportunities for this Japanese truck today is we've got an inner axle that has decided to let the grease loose. Boot is probably old rotted, so we're going to take this axle out today. We've got a boot kit that we're going to put on to replace the rubber portion, the clamps, and the grease inside that axle. We're going to put it back together and show you guys how to do that. So stay tuned. Here we go. All right, just to show everybody what it looks like when that axle decides to let the grease out, it's something like this. I'm not seeing any tears, but obviously you can see the grease that's coming out. Tightening those band clamps at this point is not going to happen. So it's typically best just to go ahead and replace that boot. We'll go ahead and re-grease it anyway, just show everybody how to do it. So here's what we're up against. We'll get this out, repaired, cleaned up, back in. All right, so once you get your wheel off, you're gonna see that you've got this axle nut cover here. For whatever reason, somebody seemed to have permatex this one to seal this area out. I don't know that that's necessary. But to pop this little guy off, a little screwdriver, just tap very easily around the circumference of this cap if you can, trying not to be too excessive or dent it. Then it will eventually just come off like that. Once you get that off, you're gonna see you've got a cotter pin here that you first need to remove. Bend that back, push the cotter pin out. This appears to be probably a 32 or 36 millimeter hex nut here. So I will pull this off and zip this off with a impact wrench. All right, so I've removed the dust cap, I've got the cotter pin out, got the castle nut off. At this point, the book says to use a special Honda tool to pull off the drum. The drum itself on this truck actually contains the studs, the wheel nut studs there. So all of that comes off as one assembly. I do not have that specific Honda tool, so I have improvised a bit. This will either work or will be a great disaster, so let's see how it goes. Well, as luck would have it, that actually worked. As you can see here, the studs are part of the drum assembly here. It's splined here on the inside. That's where your axle actually goes into there. You can see the matching splines there. All your brake mechanisms and shoes are right there. So the next thing the book says to do is to actually relieve the U-bolts from the leaf springs. We want to hold up the bottom torsion bar with the jack and really just kind of lower everything down. All right, so at this point we removed the 14 millimeter bolts here for the bump stop on the leaf springs. That's loose. That can come up now. We've also removed the one 14 millimeter bolt going to the bottom of the strut. So now that that stuff's loose, we should be able to turn our jack here and lower this torsion bar down, allowing us enough room to press the axle out of the drive hub so that we can get to it and pop it out of the transmission here. So another thing I wanted to caution everybody of, if you've never done axle installs or removals, is one thing you never want to do is hit the end of the axle here with a hammer. It ends up mushrooming the ends and it makes it to where your threads are all deformed and whatnot, and you can't get your axle nut back on. So I always like to use a piece of wood to try to hit it. Just keep that between you and a hammer, a dead blow hammer, or even a metal hammer. Or sometimes I'll even go ahead and just thread the nut on there, which kind of gives it some stability there, and do the same thing to try to get that axle to pop loose. So just a tip, pro tip from Ron, if you will, do not hit your axle with the metal hammer. All right, so at this point, a lot of off-camera work has taken place. What I ended up having to do here was actually undoing the U-bolts for the leaf springs on both sides. That gave my torsion bar enough wiggle room so that I could get the inboard axle out first, which is what the manual recommends. Once you get the inboard out, you can kind of pull the whole torsion bar over to the side away from the transmission. Once it's out and fallen down, I put my castle nut back on my axle nut here, or I'm sorry, put the castle nut back on the axle and tapped it with a good size hammer there to get that to break loose. It's loose now, and hopefully we should be able to pull this guy right out. All right, so we finally got it out. I'm gonna clean up this end here with some light sandpaper just to try to clean up that diameter a little bit. It's awfully tight. Trying to get it back in is gonna be a pain, I can tell. As you can see here, we did have a tear, so that's where we lost all of our grease. So we'll take this over to the bench now, tear it down, re-grease it, and reboot it. All right, so we got the axle over here in the vise. Got the boot kit here. First of all, special shout out to Nicholas LaRue at Smoky Mountain Imports. He was able to get me this axle boot kit basically next day. We are both in Tennessee, so that helps. Comes with your grease, your new axle boot, and new clamps for the shaft end and the hub end. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to cut this band right here off. I'm going to cut this band off here. We'll split the boot, pull it apart. That will expose all the insides of the CV axle. You'll have your bearings, you know, your end joint, and I'll show you how all that comes apart. Okay, so I've got my band clamps off. The boot I've pulled back here. I'm gonna go ahead and just pull off the end hub here. All right, so off camera, I went ahead and rebuilt the inboard side boot over here, which was the one we actually took the axle out because the boot was split. I wanted to go ahead and get that done, cleaned up on one side there to show finished product there. I also went ahead and took off the outboard side, which this is the side that goes in the hub that has all the rear brakes and whatnot. I've already taken it apart. I've pulled the grease out in hopes of being able to kind of show you guys what exactly you're doing without all the grease in the way. So to start, there's just a little, it's not even a snap ring, it's more like a just a C-clip in here. And you just want to take that C-clip and pull that out, okay? It's just a spring clip. When you get that out, you'll be able at that point to pull the axle hub end off. You can see I've cleaned this, but this thing is heavily greased whenever you take it apart. From there, you can see you've got your bearing assembly here. On the far end of the actual spline here, you do have a snap ring, a typical snap ring there, so I'll be using that snap ring pliers to get that off. There's the snap ring there, just taking that off. So once that's off, your bearing is really free to come off at that point. Hold on to those little balls there. And I try to keep the orientation of everything the way it came off to put it back on. So I'll note this being face down was how it came off there. So still a lot of grease there. This is not the cleanest job, but it is a job that we have to do. So at this point, I had already cleaned all the grease off this. Everything's pretty much dried at this point, and we will go on with the axle boot. Now the axle boot that I put on the other side, it actually went on from this end, and I slid it all the way down and mounted it back up here. I've got a new axle boot kit here from Nick at Smoky Mountain Imports. Thank you, Nick. 2-day delivery, both of us in East Tennessee. Got the grease, the boot, and the wires. So we'll just go ahead and get this boot it started, you want it to go on first. You'll notice there's a little chamfer here in your axle shaft. That's where this is going to sit. So we're going to go ahead and push it back to that point. Now from here, everything that we took off, we're pretty much just putting it right back on there. Once we put it back on there, we'll add the grease in there. We'll pull the boot back up to this end here. We'll put our boot clamps on there and should be good to go. All right, so now everything is just going back on in reverse. You're gonna put your bearing on there with your spline adapter there. You're gonna go right back on with your snap ring after that. We'll then put our hub end back on. Once the hub is on, we will add our spring ring back in there, and that'll lock everything in. We'll put the boot on, grease everything prior to that, put the bands on. So I'm taking the grease here and I'm just basically filling up the boot as much as I can. Before I pull the boot up onto the axle hub there, I'm going to actually try to just work some grease into the bearings and whatnot to make sure it gets in there and protects the ball bearings and whatnot. But you can see here, the boot's pretty well filled up at this point. Typically these kits come with plenty of grease to do the job. So since it's about to flow out there, I'm gonna toothpaste squeeze the rest of this out and just kind of work it into some of the joints of the ball bearings and whatnot here in the actual bearing assembly here of the hub. It's a dirty job. Just go with it. That's why you see Ron wearing gloves all the time. Just trying to get that in there to ensure you're getting some lubrication in there. Cut down on wear of the metal on metal for the life of the axle here. Take that and just trying to press that in there and work it in as much as you can. Just to ensure you're getting some of that pressed in there. Okay, so at this point, I'm just gonna pull the boot up over the axle end there. It is on there. Everything seems to be functioning properly here, as it should. So if you've never done one of these type of band clamps before, they do make tools for them. I know I've used it when I'm wrapping headers before, but that particular DEI header wrap bands are come with a little tool to do it to make things easier. These are not quite like those, but basically it's a glorified space age polymer tie, i.e. zip tie. Obviously for high temp applications and longevity here, we're not using plastic. But you really just want to try to get this as tight as possible and just work it. Try to hold it when you can. I like to try to hold those little tabs back and really bear down on it. I've even taken pliers before and kind of wrap it around the metal band just to get that tightness. And what you're going to do is you're actually going to fold this back over this little loop. And when you do that, the bending motion of that metal kind of locks it in place. So I'm going to do that now. Just kind of pull that and go up with it. And these two little tabs right here, you're just going to lay that down in that. Give it a little tap with a hammer. Fold these little tabs over. Tap in with a hammer as well. Wire snips. What I'll do also is I'll kind of put an indentation on this just to make sure it locks those two bands together. just to ensure it's not going to get away from us and loosen up over time. That's pretty much it. So at this point, the axle is ready to go back in. Just got a little cleanup to do here. Of the grease. It's booted. Everything will hold when you get it back in there. Show you kind of what that looks like there. Both sides. Let's go put it back in. So now that I've got the axle put back together and ready to go back in, before I do that, I'm just gonna get in here and clean all this grease splatter from the axle boot that let go. There's a lot underneath the bed as well. So just gonna get that cleaned up before we put the axle back. At this point, we've got the transmission cleaned up. All the grease splatter underneath it has been wiped down. I use Simple Green, which is one of my favorite degreasers, to clean all that up. I'll do a power wash after I get the truck back together, take it down to a local car wash station there. You see here we got the axle rebooted. It's ready to go back in. Obviously putting it back in is just in reverse order as taking it out. So one thing I did do off camera was I had to loosen the torsion bar completely away from the leaf springs. And the reason I had to do that was because the torsion bar needs to come out this way as you're pulling the axle out of the transmission first, right? So once it comes out, that axle will fall, and then you can finish basically hammering the axle out of the hub here. So I'm gonna do all this in reverse order in time lapse just to speed things up here. I'll stop once we get back to the torquing of all the bolts that we'll remove. To torque some of my bolts here just to show you what was removed. This is the bottom of the strut, 14 millimeter. That is 29 foot-pounds. 29 foot-pounds as well for the bump stop 14s. Same here, 14 millimeter is 29 foot-pounds. And right here, I try to be by the book as much as I can. I do have the manual for this, so it says for kilogram meters, converted foot-pounds is 29. You can see the axle's in at this point. There's still a little gap here, which that will get pulled in whenever we put the brake drum back on and tighten everything up on this end. Okay, so at this point, we've got everything torqued down, all of the 14 millimeter bolts for the struts, for the bump stops. I've also reattached a 12 millimeter bolt for the actual brake cable underneath the chassis there. I didn't mention, but you do have to remove that 12 millimeter bolt so that your e-brake cable is long enough for this whole side of the torsion bar to go down. So from here, we're just gonna put our brake drum back on. It's splined here, so when you get it where it wants to be, it goes in like that. You're gonna take this trapezoidal washer, if you will, put it back in there, and that basically just trues up the ID of the brake hub there so that you got a nice flat surface for your castle nut. Castle nut is next. I couldn't find a torque value in the book, so I'm gonna tighten this up, which will pull the axle back through until you get your axle hole lined up with the castle nut here, and then that's when we'll put our cotter pin back in. So the last portion of this axle installation process is to go ahead and refill your transmission. This bolt right here, 17mm head, this is your fill. Your drain is down here. You can take a 3/8 ratchet in to pop that loose. Anytime you remove these two plugs, it's always a good idea to replace this aluminum crush washer from Honda. It's pretty much the same fill and drain washer on every Honda through the 90s. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead and open up my fill, and I will run a funnel with a tube into the fill hole right here. And the way you know it's full is you basically just pour, I'm gonna use manual transmission fluid from Honda in there until it starts weeping out. And once it weeps out, you're pretty much level with where you're supposed to be inside the transmission housing on the recommended level from Honda. So here's the setup. You can see I've got my hose ran straight into the fill port of the transmission there. This is going to go all the way up to a high point, and that's where we're going to pour in the Honda manual transmission fluid. And remember guys, we're using gravity here. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. Okay, so at this point our transmission is full. You can see here that the remains of what was in the funnel is now just seeping out of the transmission. At this point, have your new washer ready to go with your fill plug. Move this out of the way, and then just as quickly as you can, get that back in there. I'm gonna first snug it up here before torquing it. Torque on this bolt here is 33 foot-pounds. To prevent the leak, I'll just stop it right there. Hey guys, thanks for being here with me today. I'm hoping that this installation video was helpful for those here in the Honda Acty community. Stay tuned for more exciting things coming your way. I'll be doing a valve cover gasket replacement, distributor O-ring replacement, and I've also got something very special coming from Japan, and let's just say it goes by the beat of its own drum. If you like what Ron's doing, let me know. Take care.